Alright, so Lords of the Fallen just dropped another dev update. Last time I covered one of their updates, a lot of you mentioned that combat was not the only issue. The Umbral sections were a big part of it too. This time around, they're getting right to it. And if you played the last game, you already know that Umbral wasn't just another mechanic you occasionally used, it was basically the whole identity of the game, for better or for worse. Some people thought it was one of the coolest ideas in a Souls-like, this whole dual realm system where you're constantly shifting between worlds, but at the same time, a lot of players never really connected with it and treated it more like an obstacle rather than something they actually wanted to engage with. And what stood out to me right away in this update is that the devs seem fully aware of that, because they're not talking about small improvements or minor tweaks, they're straight up framing this as Umbral 2.0. They keep coming back to that idea that what we saw before was just a foundation, almost like a first try that didn't really reach its full potential. And now they finally have the tech, the experience, and honestly probably the feedback from players to push it into something much more central to the game. I think the Umbral system is going to define whether the sequel actually lands or not, because if they get this right, they could finally make Lords of the Fallen stand out instead of always being the lesser Souls-like. You know, the shy cousin nobody really talks about at family get-togethers. This could really elevate the entire experience. One of the first things they say, and yeah, it sounds like typical dev talk at first, is that Umbral is going to be bigger, bolder, and bloodier. But the more they explain it, the more it feels like that's not just marketing this time around. It seems to reflect a pretty big shift in how they see this world. In the first game, Umbral had a very specific vibe. It was cold, empty, almost sterile in a strange sort of way. Like this quiet, decaying version of reality that didn't really change that much as you progress through the game. This time around, they're moving away from that completely and describing it as something that's actively growing, evolving, almost like it's alive in a really unsettling way. Not alive in the sense that it's vibrant or beautiful, but alive in the sense that it's rotting, spreading, reacting, and turning into something worse the longer you're exposed to it. They even made that distinction themselves. Which sounds good on paper, I guess. I just hope they actually mean it. It better not just be, hey, instead of 2 enemies, now you get 3 enemies. You know, the classic, the game is better because more. And well, the way they talk about the visuals really reinforces that. Instead of just being dark and eerie, they're leaning into something much more visceral, much more physical and gory. They compare it to things like decaying flesh, butcher shop imagery, environments that feel wet, dense and oppressive, and that's the kind of direction that immediately makes it stand out more. They're leaning a bit less into the dark fantasy setting and into something more deliberate. I hate to make this comparison, but if Lords 2023 was their Dark Souls or Elden Ring, maybe Lords 2 will be their Bloodborne, which, just in case, is my favorite Souls game. Nothing else has come close to the style and feel of that game, which, of course, we'll never get that remake now. Getting back to the point, personally, I think that's exactly what Lords of the Fallen needed, because the original already had a pretty strong concept. It just didn't always feel distinct enough once you got used to it. This sounds like they're really trying to push that identity further, to the point where the moments you enter Umbral, it's not just about a visual filter, it's a completely different atmosphere that changes how you feel and how you play. What really caught my attention isn't just the visual side of things, it's how they're changing your relationship with Umbral as a player. In the first game, even if you liked the idea, it often ended up feeling like something you were using out of necessity. You'd enter Umbral because the game asked you to, maybe to solve a puzzle or to get past a blocked path, maybe cross a bridge or something, and then the goal was usually to get out as quickly as possible before things got overwhelming. That loop kinda worked, but it also made Umbral feel a bit limited, almost like a tool rather than a fully realized part of the world. And that's clearly something they're trying to fix this time, because they keep emphasizing that they want players to actually engage with it, not just tolerate it. The way they describe it now, it's not just about stepping into another realm anymore, it's much more aggressive, much more intentional. Instead of casually entering Umbral, you're ripping into it, forcing your way in and out, giving it a different kind of energy altogether. It's not passive, it's not safe, and it's definitely not something you want to do without thinking. More importantly, they talk about shifting the player's role from being a passive presence to an active participant, which could mean your actions inside Umbral actually matter more. The world will respond to you and become something you're interacting with on a deeper level rather than just navigating through it. At the same time, they're trying to strike this balance where you want to go into Umbral because there are rewards, opportunities, something cool actually happening in there. but without you ever really feeling completely comfortable while you're doing it. It's supposed to feel like you're making a risky decision every time, not just following a routine. And if they can actually pull that off, that's the kind of design that keeps players engaged instead of pushing them away. Where this really starts to come together is in how they're redesigning the underlying systems. Because it's not just about making Umbral look better or feel more intense, it's about changing how it behaves moment to moment. In the first game, once you understood how it worked, a lot of the tension came from a timer-based system that gradually increased the pressure, which meant you always had a rough idea of what was coming and how long you had before things got dangerous. This time, they're moving away from the predictable structure and replacing it with something that's much more reactive and intuitive, where the danger isn't just tied to time, but to what you're actually doing.
And what does it even mean? Like, Umbral is now alive, as much as it can be, right? What would that evoke visually? What would that evoke mechanically? And it feels like it's some, festering hellhole, which is pretty much on brief on what we're trying.
Instead of watching a meter fill up and preparing for the next phase, you're dealing with a system that responds to your actions, which makes the whole experience feel less controlled and hopefully a lot more dynamic. I'm guessing there will be some separate modifiers you use once you're inside of Umbral, getting you better rewards depending on what you do or what monstrosities you kill. Something like taking double damage, maybe having a different amount of time, maybe a modifier on your health or on your stamina. That shift alone changes how you approach it, because you can't just optimize your route or rely on memorization anymore. You have to constantly adapt to what's happening around you. And on top of that, they're making Umbral itself feel more hostile, almost like it's aware of you being there and actively pushing back. I really wonder what they mean by that. As they described enemies not just appearing in waves that spawn in predictable patterns, they seem to appear in more unexpected ways. Maybe some of them evolve from other enemies, or even return after you've already dealt with them, which can add another layer of uncertainty. Kind of like the Pursuer in Dark Souls 2, right? So it seems you're not just fighting difficulty, you're dealing with unpredictability. And that's where a lot of the tension is going to come from. I'm not so sure about it, to be honest. It almost sounds like a more aggressive version of the first, which could kind of get annoying once you were getting attacked by 5 or 6 faceless enemies. I hope this means I'll have a greater variety of monsters and bosses and enemies. From everything they're describing, it sounds like that's exactly what they seem to be aiming for. Creating a version of Umbral that feels less like a system you can master and more like something you have to survive. One of the more interesting things they start hinting at, and this is something I didn't expect them to lean into this much, is how the line between Axiom, the real world, and Umbral is starting to break down. In the first game, the two realms felt very separate, almost like flipping a switch between the two versions of the same space. You knew exactly when you were in one or the other, and the gameplay reflected that pretty clearly. This time around, it sounds like the separation isn't nearly as clean anymore. They describe Umbral as something that doesn't just exist alongside the real world, but actually bleeds into it, corrupts it, and changes how those spaces feel even before you fully transition. So instead of thinking of it as a safe world versus danger world, it becomes more of a spectrum, where even Axiom starts to feel unstable depending on what's going on around you. They even talk about areas where the veil seems to be thinning, where you can kind of step into Umbral and then step right back out without being fully locked in.
One of the things I remember when you and I first sat down and we began to look at the narrative and the way that the player character interacts with it, that we wanted to have more of a synchronicity between the player and Umbral this time around.
Which could actually change the pacing a lot. It'd be pretty cool if it gives us more freedom in how we move between the two, and more importantly, it makes those transitions feel less scripted and more natural. This direction seems to reinforce the idea that Umbral isn't just a mechanic anymore. It's a presence that constantly affects the world. It's not something you visit occasionally, it's something that's always kind of there in some way or form. And that could make the game feel more cohesive this time around. At the same time, it adds a layer of tension even when you're not fully in there, because you know it's never that far away. Now, one of the big criticisms of the first game was that once you spent enough time in Umbral, you started to recognize everything. The enemies, the patterns, the encounters, it all became familiar a bit too quickly, which took a lot away of the fear factor. Now, they're clearly trying to avoid that by making both the enemies and the encounters much more dynamic. They introduced this idea of morphs, where enemies from Axiom don't just exist as they are, but can transform into something completely different once Umbral gets involved. This opens up a lot of possibilities, because it means you're not just learning one version of an enemy, you're dealing with multiple variations that can change depending on the situation. What makes that more interesting is how they tie into unpredictability. They talk about moments where you'll see something happen and your immediate reaction is just, what the fuck is that? And that's exactly the kind of reaction they're aiming for. Not just difficulty, but confusion, surprise, that split second where you don't know how to respond. Now, the first game had a bit of that, but got somewhat annoying once you got used to it. Here it sounds like they want to keep you slightly off balance the entire time. Hopefully not in an unfair way, but in a way that forces you to stay engaged. You can't just rely on memory or repetition anymore. You have to actually read what's happening and react to it. They also mentioned that enemies behave differently depending on where you are, which adds another layer to it. So it's not just about visual variety, it's mechanical variety as well. Different aggression levels, different behaviors, different interactions. All of that builds towards making each encounter feel less predictable. And that's exactly what this kind of game needs, because once things become too familiar, the tension tends to disappear. This sounds like they're trying to make sure that never really happens. Something else I noticed is just how far they seem willing to push the tone this time. It's not just about making Umbral darker or scarier, it's about making it feel oppressive in a way that sticks with you even after you leave. They talk about it being dense, claustrophobic, something almost suffocating. I wonder how they'll achieve that. Hopefully not just through enclosed locations or environments. I'm thinking they'll try to tweak what we perceive about the world. Maybe some messed up looking visuals, or trying to improve on the soundscape to really catch our attention. On that note, the audio definitely seems like a big part of that, even though they didn't go into a ton of detail. They hint at this idea that it's not just background noise anymore, it's something that reinforces the feeling that the world is alive, that something is always moving, always reacting, even when we can't see it. That kind of subtle design can make a huge difference, especially in a game where atmosphere is doing a lot of the heavy lifting. It kind of sounds like they're not trying to make it fun in a traditional sense, maybe more about just eliciting an emotional response to the situation, or making you want to explore it because it's interesting, but at the same time giving you a little bit of an uneasy feeling while doing it. They also touch on how leaving Umbral should feel like a relief itself, like stepping out of something heavy and finally being able to breathe again. And that contrast is important because without it, the intensity loses impact. If everything feels the same, nothing stands out. But if Umbral really feels that oppressive, then even the normal world starts to feel different by comparison. So after going through all of this, I think the biggest takeaway for me is that, once again, they seem to be listening to feedback. They could have easily just refined what worked, smoothed out a few rough edges, and called it a day. But instead, they're treating it like something that needed to evolve in a much bigger way. At the same time, this is one of those situations where everything sounds great on paper, but it really depends on how it feels when you actually play it. Because we've all seen systems like this before that sound amazing from devs, and then in practice it's not like that at all, or just doesn't hit the same way you expect it to. That being said, I do think they're focusing on the right things, making it more dynamic, less predictable, more integrated into the world, and more responsive to the player. Those are all changes that directly address the biggest issues people had with the original. And if they can actually deliver on that balance to keep talking about, where Umbral is something you want to engage with but never really feel comfortable in, then this could end up being something really special. And well, if you've seen any of my previous vids, you know I love Souls-like, so I tend to be a bit more on the optimistic side of things for these types of games. I'm definitely more interested after this update than I was before. It feels like they understand what didn't quite work last time, and they're actually trying to fix it in a meaningful way instead of just polishing the surface. I just hope they actually pull it off. Alright then, I think that's all from me for now, so what do you all think? Will this be enough to get you back into Lords of the Fallen, or do you think they'll still have to add something else to separate it from the hundreds of other Souls-likes? Either way, if you like this quick sort of breakdown, make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and enable notifications, you know, all the usual stuff. Thanks for watching the whole way through, and once again, have a great one.
Paths through light. Paths through shadow. I will walk them with you, wherever they may lead.